Hello and welcome to Infinity. I'm Charlie Seraphin, and for the next half hour we're going to be talking about synchronicity. Strange coincidences that happen to all of us. What do they mean? Our guest is Jean Shinoda Bolen, a psychiatrist and Jungian analyst. Dr. Bolen is a fellow of the American Psychiatric Association and is the author of The Tao of Psychology and Goddesses in Every Woman. Dr. Bolen is clinical professor of psychiatry at UC Med Center in San Francisco. What is synchronicity?
Synchronicity is a $2 word that really means meaningful coincidences. A psychologist named Carl Jung coined the word mainly to describe something that was going on that he noticed. He never did explain how it worked. It's the coincidence between something in your mind and something that occurs out in the world. For example, you might have a dream, or maybe you had a dream last night, in which someone that you knew from way back when showed up. Someone you hadn't thought about for a long time. And then on the street today, you might run into that person for the first time in 2 decades. It makes an impact. It feels eerie. It feels significant only to the person to whom it happens. So it's a coincidence between an inner event and outer happening that hits a chord in the person. Most of these things are in the realm of ESP type phenomenon, and that it can be like a clairvoyant experience. You get an image of something that's happening, and you find out later that it went on while you were thinking about it. You can have a dream or a thought that comes true. You can receive a message from someone very dear to you who's in trouble, and you pick it up, either as an image or sometimes as a feeling in your body. A woman I know had the experience of suddenly having a terrible pain in her side that lasted just for a little while at a certain moment of the day. And then it went away, and she knew she was fine, but she couldn't explain the pain. And she found out when she got home and checked her messages that a friend of hers had been in an automobile accident that had ruptured her spleen right in the same place that she had felt the pain. That's a telepathic message she felt that connected the friend with herself. And all of these events tend to make the person feel connected in some way to something, to either the person or to the event, in a way that makes that person feel that there is an invisible connecting link between us and the rest of the universe. So it hits into a spiritual feeling at times when one feels truly connected to other human beings in a way that you can't explain.
And there are a myriad of examples that people experience, and they're, as you suggest, they're not all the same. So what about the instance of having the dream of seeing the old friend and the old friend never appears? Does that mean that you're not in sync
And
as
that
opposed
means
to
that
synchronicity?
That means that it is just an ordinary dream that did not get underlined by a synchronistic event. Sometimes, dreams keep telling you what you're not paying attention to often. And when you have a synchronistic event, a real-life occurrence that is eerily like the dream, you really remember the dream. You get the message that, hey, that was important. And often I've found through my clinical work that is exactly, if there's a point to it, that's the point to it. It says, hey, pay attention. You've had a similar kind of theme in your dream for umpteen times, and you still haven't listened. And here the outer world reflects the very same message. It's a way of interpreting what goes on in your life through synchronistic events or through dreams. And sometimes it's a matter of taking an unusual event and wondering if this unusual event were like a dream, what would the message be? For example, if a person, for me, I have a kind of special relationship with a red Mustang convertible that I drive around. And I've often noticed that when something goes wrong with that car, it really reflects what's going on in my psyche. I mean, on one hand, I just take care of the car because I'm, live in this plane and all that. But I then think, is this a metaphor? And usually it has something to do with the electrical system or it has something to do with the battery. And since I'm a person who's often going full bore, charging, depleting energy, hardly without, well, I sometimes don't realize I'm about to run out of energy. But if my car runs out of energy first, I kind of often have reflected that it's not surprising this is when it happens, because it does parallel me.
You take a break and recharge your own battery.
Yeah.
Okay. What about some people might suggest that this is all a game that you would play within your conscious and subconscious mind. It's something that you're just projecting. Your car breaks down because it breaks down, and then you put your own psyche into that car. Or you had a pain in your side and the other individual, the people who try to debunk the synchronistic things that we all experience.
That's true. It is very much a wondering if there is a connection between two series of events, and at some level it is a way of experiencing life and wondering about another dimension. For example, a lot of people don't remember dreams, and they're missing out on a dimension. And but they may not know it, but a person who dreams a lot and suddenly stops dreaming really feels like something's missing. Some way of connecting with part of himself or herself is no longer available, and it feels like you're only receiving things on one channel instead of two. And life goes on, but it's somehow not quite as meaningful. Looking at the world in a synchronistic way, seeing that there are coincidences between what's going on inside and outside, does the same thing. You can live perfectly fine without making those connections, but when you do make those connections, it gives you often a deeper sense of not only being connected to some underlying universal connection, which basically gives you a spiritual feeling at times, but it adds this dimension of something to think about, something to consider that is meaningful to the person.
So far we've dealt with it, and my questions have come from the Western rational industrial side of my brain, and yet there are cultures that accept synchronistic events and synchronistic thinking without calling it that it's just an absolute natural part of the way that they live. What about some of those cultures? Are the Eastern cultures, for example, accept much more of what we call ESP or psychic things than we do?
Very often. Like there is a book of wisdom or oracles that's used widely now in this country since the 1950s, but goes back to pre-Confucius in China, a book called the I Ching. And there is no reason on earth, rationally, if you throw 3 coins 6 times, that you're going to find some pattern that you can then look up in the book and have the book give you directly a message. And yet people who are attuned to this system find that it often is extraordinarily right on. And that this way of doing things was accepted in the East is part of the whole sense in Eastern religions that there is a oneness or a Tao that underlies all reality, all living things, everything that is tangible in the universe. The Eastern notion is that we see the manifestations of the separateness, like the 10,000 things, but the important thing that really matters is the oneness that underlies everything. And that's something that Western folks often know when they're kids and often forget when they get older. For me, it was when I was a Girl Scout, camping out under the stars, looking at the stars every night, looking at the shooting stars. And somewhere in that repetitive nightly ritual, something shifted in my own soul or my own innards that provided me with a profound insight that I was connected to all of that universe out there, and that universe had a significance. I was part of it all. Other people may experience it in a different way when they feel that everything out there is inside. Now, this is an intuitive feeling that no logical, rational, there's no logical, rational way to arrive at that same conclusion, except as a theory. But when you feel it intuitively in yourself, it's like you know it. And this sense of oneness that underlies everything is very often something that people from ages 8 to 17 feel. And it may end up influencing their life a great deal, or they may forget it. Synchronicity, as a psychological idea, brings that back up as a possibility, that you can think with the mind of an adult and as a psychiatrist and as an academician and scientist, and make sense of something, speaking for myself, that I felt intuitively when I was a kid. And that sense of oneness may come up when you have a moment of synchronistic event, when you are moved by a coincidence between an important event and the coincidence that lets you know about it, for example.
Do you in your work encourage people to remember their childhood, to remember those feelings? I'm thinking back as you're talking to a little voice I haven't heard in years and years and years, but I used to converse with quite a bit as a child.
Yeah. Perhaps one of the differences of working in a Jungian way is that the spiritual, the notion that there is a spiritual center in the personality is very important. So all psychiatrists, all psychologists go back to childhood events. Most psychiatrists and psychologists focus on the traumas that happen because that is what brings a person into therapy. They hurt, and they hurt badly in their psyche because something in the present resonates with something very painful in the past. Well, a Jungian way of looking at things might also encourage that same person to also look at the spiritual or the connection or the religious feeling that they had as a youngster and then walked away from, often because the stuff that came with it got pretty difficult to take, the dogma or the narrowness or something like that. So the person throws it all out, maybe with the bathwater, so to speak, and then later, especially in midlife, begin to connect with the feeling that they once had way back when and put it in a different context. So yeah, I do encourage people to remember just what you just described yourself, the inner dialogue with a wiser self, or a sense of wonder. Get people back to nature so they walk out in the mountains where they felt something once before.
You made reference to the term the Tao. Would you explain what the Tao is and what it has to do with psychology again? Maybe we could rephrase it.
The Tao is one way of expressing the notion that there is a connection, an invisible connection, between everything in the universe, between ourselves and all living things, and ourselves and the whole, well, the enormity of the universe. And that we are part of a whole rather than singular, separated folk.
And in psychiatric terms, that's a good notion to hold. It brings peace to an individual?
People need both. They need to have a sense of their individual need to be assertive, to be in the world as an individual, but if they are just there as looking out for number one, then it's a very lonely world, and there is a sense of isolation and anxiety or angst that comes along with it. If that individual who operates well in the world can also connect with a sense of really being part of everyone else and connected with a spiritual center, call it God or Tao, what have you, then with both you have a person who has a sense of wholeness and connectedness as well as competence. So that both are important. Usually we don't call it the Tao. I mean, I in working with the notion of synchronicity and seeing that there was a spiritual element to it, saw how the Tao as an Eastern notion fit, and so I connected the two in my book. But psychologists and psychiatrists don't generally do that.
Is there a way to teach synchronicity? If I come to you and say, years ago I used to experience those kinds of things. I used to have the dreams and then run into the friends, and I used to have the battery breakdown, and it was a reflection of my own psyche and what was happening. But I don't seem to be in sync anymore. I don't seem to be having those things. Is there a way that you could teach me to be more synchronistic?
The way is to get more out of a rat race mentality and into a timeless mentality. And most people have some idea of how to do that. It may be, some people do it when they run, and they move into a kairos time, meaning participation in time, instead of chronos time, which means that you just watch the minutes tick away and you're always aware that there's not enough time. It is in that timeless space in our psyche that we most often can feel connected to synchronistic events. And some people do it in meditation, some people do it running, some people do it painting, some people do it by going up to the mountains or down to the beach, some people do it by listening to music. What it has in common is it takes you out of your usual linear mentality and puts you in another space. But it's also, you also have to have the idea about it. I mean, I find I turn people on to the notion of looking for synchronicity, that without the concept, they may not think about unusual events that happen to them. With the notion, they start making those connections, and it's fun.
Is there order in the universe?
One hopes so. When you are feeling that you are flowing with the universe, that synchronistic events are like lanterns along your way, that you're following a path personally in which your heart and soul are in it, and as you do that, it seems as if the world makes it easier rather than harder, then there really is a sense that there might not only be an order in the universe, but that you might, for that period of your life, be sort of tapped into that order.
What about groups of people? Could you say that a state has a psychology? Does California have a psychology, or Southern California, or Northern California, or any country? Does the United States have a psychology? And I'm thinking of it in terms of being with the Tao. Is California with the Tao or not with the Tao? Can you ever lump groups of people within geographical barriers or psychographical barriers?
Well, California, especially Northern California, has much more of a receptivity to nature, ecology, the feminine, spiritual movements, and all of those are connected. So that, say, contrasting this state with a much more macho-oriented, let's conquer nature, let's put our imprint on the world rather than let's live with the world, in harmony with the world. I mean, there are differences.
Can those areas, those countries or states or geographical locations or mindsets or whatever, can they change? And do they very often change? Or are people destined, hypothetically, not to offend anyone who lives in Montana, but let's say Montana is the antithesis of what Northern California is. Although there are a lot of environmentalists in Montana too, but let's say they're very macho and they want to carve the side out of the mountain kind of thing instead of appreciating it the way that it is. Do we very often see large masses of people changing in their receptiveness to the oneness of the universe?
I think we've really started to see it in the last just couple of years in relationship to the possibility that we might have an influence on keeping our planet intact. I mean, given that we seem to have a kind of psychic numbing to the whole notion that any of us could have any influence on whether the superpowers blow us up or not, and that nobody made any effort to influence our governments until just recently. It seems as if collectively people have a hope that they can influence whether the bombs will go off or not. Now that's a major change in.
Is it a synchronistic change? Is it something that's happening to a whole bunch of people at the same time in a kind of a spiritual or mystical way, or is it just a political event?
I think it's a mixture of both, but I certainly wouldn't, I don't think it would happen without a kind of collective synchronistic, if you will, connection between people. I think of a metaphor that is not exactly a synchronistic metaphor, but explains something of this phenomena, that if there are a whole bunch of individuals trying to do something, they think at first they're doing it by themselves, but if there's enough people who get behind something, then suddenly, often it manifests in the world. And to me, as a medical student, chemist sort of person in my education, it reminds me of the situation which you have a beaker and you keep pouring salts into solution, and at first for a long time it stays clear. You pour it in, it gets a little murky, it gets clear, and then at a certain crucial moment you pour in just enough so that a whole crystalline structure precipitates out. And at that moment it's like every small molecule that would have been poured in before now becomes part of the whole, and it can be seen and appreciated. Up until that moment everything seemed random and unconnected, and suddenly you see the pattern and then feel part of that pattern. And often synchronicity, that sense of oneness, touches people in crowds in which there is something very significant about what they're doing. People have said, look, I didn't feel the sense of the Tao or oneness when I was meditating all by myself in a little room. I felt it when I was at a Boy Scout jamboree with 1,000 other boys around me, or I felt it when I was marching for a peace movement, and I suddenly had a sense of oneness and connectedness to everything.
There are 3 types of synchronistic events. Could you give us an example of each of the 3 types again so that we can order them in our own minds?
Jung, this goes back to Jung and his description of synchronicity as a connection between something going on inside and something that happens outside. Clairvoyance is another explanation for that. And there was a time, for example, when I'm trying to remember the name of the chap, but a man who had a vision of his hometown burning at a time when communication wasn't any good at all. And then to find out a couple days later when the messenger did come, that was so, that at the moment that he had that image, that was going on. That's a clairvoyant image.
Okay. That's one type.
That's one type. And the other is precognition, when you have a dream or a notion or some kind of strong hunch that just comes to you. Maybe hunch is not such a good word. It's more that you were not out thinking about something. It just sort of was visited upon you that something is going to happen that does. And so the coincidences between that internal image and something that happens down the road. My grandfather used to do that a lot. He was a fellow who, whenever someone close to him in Japan died, he would have a dream or he would have an image that person came to him carrying a suitcase, as if to say, so long, I'm traveling on. And he was living in New York City at the time, and they were over in Japan, and it took a long time for the message to come via boat and then across the country to New York. My mother said that when the message finally came, they already always knew it, because Granddad had come down after, say, a dream and said, oh, so-and-so died last night. I saw him in a dream. I guess that's actually clairvoyance. Or
it's a kind of a combination, though. It's a knowing in advance of actually knowing or verification. Yeah. Sometimes the event would happen after the fact.
And the third thing is just a direct message sent from one person to another, two people connected.
There's a story in your book about someone who makes rain in the midst of a serious drought. Could you tell that story?
That's a beautiful story called A Rainmaker, and Richard Wilhelm told it to Jung, and in the story he was saying that there was a great drought in China, in that province he was in, and it didn't rain. And everybody did all kinds of things to try and make it rain. The Chinese set off firecrackers, and the Protestants prayed, and the Catholics said masses, and it never rained, it never rained. So finally they said, we will have to go find the rainmaker. And so they set off for a far distant province and brought back, eventually, this little old man. Little old man comes to the province, and they say, well, what do you want? What can we do to help you? And he said, just leave me alone. Just put me in a little house and leave me alone. So he goes into his little house, and one day goes by, nothing happens. 2 days goes by, and the third day, the skies open up and the rain comes down. And Wilhelm, in typically European fashion, then went to see him and say, okay, what'd you do to make it rain? And the little old man said, I didn't do anything. So he backtracked and said, okay, what have you done since you've been here? And he said, oh, that's easy. I come from a place where the country is in Tao, which means everything is in harmony. I come to this place, and it's all disordered, it's not in harmony, and originally I get a little bit put off by that disorder too, and then I come into this house and I get quiet, and suddenly I'm in harmony, and then, of course, I am in Tao, and then of course the rain would come, because that's part of the harmony. And the message of the rainmaker is an Eastern one, but it's also a Christian one. The Christian one is the phrase about see the lilies of the field, that if you take care of the kingdom of God within, or center with one's soul inside, that outside what one truly needs in this world will come. That there's a synchronistic promise in most religions that if you center, get in touch with God, Spirit, Tao, whatever you want to call it, in an inner way, that the outer basics that you need will come. And that's part of the synchronicity of most religions.
Is it working in the United States right now?
I think that one of the things about spirituality and center and Tao is that the energy that one comes to trust has more love in it than any other kind of energy. And our country as a whole doesn't do that. And so it's much more dealing with just one half of the psyche, the side that has to do with just taking care of the tangibles and not taking care of the intangibles. But that's on the government side. But on the people's side, a lot of folk are starting to deal more and more with the intangibles.
And what the world needs now is love.
Yes.
This is Infinity. Remember to keep your mind open and listen to your heart. I'm Charlie Seraphin. Thank you for listening.